And welcome back, everyone, to the latest adventures of the Monk and the Monarch. With me, the Monarch, and as always, my co host, Mildra the Monk.
Hello.
So, today, again, stepping a little bit away from our usual anime related topics, we talk about the fall of E3.
And once again, I think it's important to note that even though anime is the focus in this podcast, that intersects with a lot of other material. And and that is a perfect excuse to talk about video games in this case. Thus the discussion on E3, the Electronic Entertainment Expo, which was one of the big pillars and one of the big events in the gaming sphere for about as long as we'd been alive until last year when it was given its sunset for various reasons. Some of which will get into the legitimacy, and some will go into why the reasoning given was suspect.
Now, for just a little bit of backstory, E3 has been around a very long time, and it hasn't always been a focus on gaming. It was an expo for like all the latest electronic stuff.
It was a trade show.
Yeah. Now, eventually, gaming became the focus for, I think, possibly most of its run once that part took off.
Hmm. Uh, especially since it was it was largely a te- I'd say it was largely a downstream from Silicon Valley kind of tech show in its early years. Um, with the burgeoning technology shifts that came about in the wake of the 1980s. Though I think, if I'm not mistaken, E3 started out in, I want to say, the late 80s, early 90s.
I believe that's correct. I'm pretty sure it was in the 80s.
Oh, also I double checked. It started out in 1995, so
Oh,
I wasn't too far off.
I
Um,
was horribly off. I was thinking it would have been the mid 80s.
it was always held at the Los Angeles Convention Center. Um, and originally was not too far off from computer-based trade shows. Some stuff like CES, which I believe is still going on, or the European Computer Trade Show, which um has been discontinued. That was discontinued all the way back in 2004. Um, whereas CES is still going. Um, it's go Although that's a January thing that's held at the Las Vegas Convention Center.
Yeah.
And the fact that that one is still going is going to tie into some of the things we'll get into later.
Yeah. Now, as mentioned, like, whenever stuff gets shown off at E3, that, even when it became like the big gamer thing, all the companies still treated E3 as a trade show. Like, you didn't see stuff like you would at any other kind of convention with people showing dressed up. Off and on, it's been media only that have been allowed into E3.
Yeah, there's one story that Tom Kalinske who at one point was the CEO of Sega America, had brought up regarding CES and why something like E3 was felt to be necessary because of the growing position gaming was having. I'd just like to read this off. Uh, the CES organizers used to put the video game industry way, way in the back. In 1991, they put us in a tent, and you had to walk past all the porn vendors to find us. That particular year, it was pouring rain, and the rain leaked right over our new Genesis system. I was very furious with the way CES treated the video game industry, and I felt we were a more important industry than they were giving us credit for. Unsurprisingly, CES did not have a presence of Sega back in in 1992, and they weren't the only ones who felt like they were getting shit on because a bunch of other companies ended up leaving.
But yeah,
And
I think that's probably when E3, or at least shortly after that, really started to earn a presence in terms of gaming.
hmm of course, then a few years later, you've got the foundation of what's now known as the ESA, or the Entertainment Software Association. Originally, it was called the IDSA, Interactive Digital Software Association, and most mostly because this was that early '90s period where a bunch of games were getting hounded in the media because of unregulation and the protect the children type, the Lieberman fucks, um,
Yeah.
and the idea was to found a commission, and shortly because right around that time, give or take, the foundation of the ESRB became a thing. Uh, but apparently they try in those early days they tried to see if they could work things out with the CES. Try and have some sort of collaboration or some sort of crossover. It didn't work. I'd ima- I'd imagine because CES still had that low opinion of it, or didn't think it was as important as other avenues. But still, putting you in a tent way in the back. What the fuck, man? Not only
Yeah.
way in the tent, but putting you next to the porn vendors. That's if I was running things at that time, I'd probably look at that as an insult.
Yeah.
So one could say that the burgeoning game companies looked at that and said, "Fine, we'll do our own trade show with blackjack and hookers." Okay, maybe not the hookers. This is Los Angeles, not Vegas.
It's probably still pretty easy to get a hooker down there. Just, don't put it on the marquee so you don't get looked into too much.
But obvi- there was some early uh, there was some early conflicts just because of scheduling, and of course, a few years into it, CES decides, hey, why don't we try doing our own video game conference about 3 or 4 years after E3 was already set up. That that lasted for about 3 months before the CEA's CEO decided, you know what, this is not worth it.
They probably didn't realize just how hard one of these shows actually was to put together.
hmm And apparently they had tried to do a Japanese version in '96, and the only reason it didn't and it seemed that it was going to get some association with TV Asahi, who is one of the bigger TV networks in Japan. I say one of, that's kind of putting it mildly. But Sony, who was the original sponsor for that Japanese E3 in '96, bailed in favor of doing their own PlayStation Expo. The only one of the big Japanese companies that showed up for that Japanese E3 was Nintendo. I- And because of that, it kind of didn't work, because Sega had pulled out of the thing at the last minute. Although since we're dealing with '96, I have to wonder if this was another case of Sega arguing with itself. Because you look at Sega's history, there's plenty of times where the Japanese branch and the US branch were arguing with each other,
I'm not surprised. Sega's had
and
an interesting history.
which if that idea of a company competing with itself sounds stupid, congratulations, you have brain cells.
But yeah, I think like what was it? I believe when the PlayStation was getting shown off at E3, that might actually have been really when E3 started its transition into a mostly game centered show. Like it never completely dropped off all the other tech stuff they'd show off. That has been there well into even the more recent years.
Hmm.
But yeah, a couple years in is really when it started becoming known as the place for your gaming
Yeah.
announcements and showcases.
Um, there was a brief bit of time where it wasn't at the LA Convention Center. Like in '97 and '98, it was at the Georgia World Conference Center in Atlanta, which unsu- unsurprisingly, a lot less people showed up. Because you spend your first few years at the LA Convention Center, and a lot of the game development was still in the California area. Then all of a sudden they're having everything move to Georgia for 2 years.
I mean, at no point have we said E3 has always made the brightest of decisions.
Hmm.
But I think it's like after they do, in fact, move back over to LA after this, I think this is just kind of an almost uninterrupted growth of E3 from then for the next several years.
There were some problems in the 2000s. Um, one of them was that some exhibitors were expressing concerns about the rising costs of presenting there, because something it's I know for how a lot of people look at it, they'll look at the at just the presentations that the bigger companies end up doing. Um, but keep in mind there's all the countless booths of various studios presenting not a slew of games, but just one or two games at most. Because again, this is a trade show, and I've been to my fair share of trade shows for various pursuits, and with a lot of them, you have that variety. Uh, even the one time I went to a car expo way back in the day, but when it comes to high costs, we're talking like $5 to $10 million for a booth in 2006 money.
And as time goes on, that becomes more and more of a problem.
Yeah, now there was also some folk who were expressing concern about non quote unquote industry professionals showing up, like bloggers. And there there was, as stupid as that sounds, there was a decent reason to have that concern, since those were things that led to the decline of the Comdex trade show in Vegas. And that had been going for a hell of a lot longer. That started out in the late 70s.
Because I don't know when it was E3 first changed to media only, or whatever the
Um,
actual term for that's supposed to be.
they they did down they did attempt to restructure in 2006.
Yeah.
Um, but they also moved it to the Barker hangar at the Santa Monica airport and limited the attendance to 10,000.
That said, I actually think a lot of the bloggers being able to do that may have been more helpful for E3, more than they may have thought at the time.
Well, the ESA
Yeah.
got blown out for that move because it meant that the external media coverage on E3 was vastly reduced.
Yeah. And of course, like the biggest outlets out there that would be invited to report on it are largely going to be talking about the biggest stuff. Because you know that's going to be what draws the most eyes.
Um,
But with a
I
lot of
do.
the bloggers, you'd see a lot more of the other things that were catching their interest. A lot more niche reporting on what was going on in E3.
What I'm reminded of is the guard change that I've seen happen when it comes to the media core for motorsport. Like a lot for the longest time, you've had this new crop of YouTubers and bloggers and tweeters and the like, instead of the old um newspaper journal guard in those media cores. However, despite that, the governing body of a lot of those motorsports will not raise a stink about it, because they know that appealing to those YouTubers and the like is key to expand the growth of the sport. You know, best not to turn the sport into a country club, as it were.
Yeah.
Um, but around 2008, we had the first major pullout when Activision had pulled out, and they were a part of the ESA from day one, and had the attitude of we're too big for E3, and of course. Of course, 2008. They were riding high off of World of Warcraft, so make of that what you will. And although I'd imagine not wanting to pull double duty, because of course BlizzCon was still a thing, just at the Anaheim Convention Center.
But yeah, like I think I can't remember. It was probably like the 2015s, mid 2015s, mid 2010s. That like at this point, a lot of people still loved E3. A lot of people were always tuning into it.
E3, E3, with the advent of the internet, and especially with certain sites in the early 2000s, like E365, E3 started to become an event, and that only accelerated further with the advent of live streaming, or just internet video. Period.
Oh yeah, because you could see people reacting in real time to the stuff coming out as time went on. You got all kinds of different reactions to the stuff. And again, the niche reporting, so you were seeing a lot more of the smaller stuff that was getting shown off at E3 that you may not have originally saw.
Mm-hmm.
It was basically a cultural milestone. It was a huge deal for a very long time.
Yeah, but and it's important to keep in mind that I know that there's the presence that it was closed off to journalists. There were some years where it was semi open, but there was always this attempt to try and balance, because the industry people didn't like it being open, and the people who actually wanted to make money off the thing wanted as many eyes on it as possible. So you have this tug of war between the two mindsets. Um, then in 2009, they decided to open it a bit more, cap the attendance at 45,000, and have it closed to the public. Oh, and of course, in in 20, but I'd say in the 2010s, the a big chunk of the power ended up being lost because, well, companies like Nintendo and EA would opt not to showcase, but also the shifting way in which games were advertised has started to change with the rise of streaming,
I'll say it's
and the
kind of
rise of
funny.
reliable streaming.
So it's kind of funny just because a lot of the things that kind of help propel E3 to be so big are kind of what started the downfall. Because, yeah, the internet did wonders for E3 as a big event, but I'm going to steal a tweet. I don't remember who made this tweet, but as they put it at the time, if Reggie from Nintendo were to say he was going to announce the new Zelda game from the Arby's bathroom stall, all of the same people are going to be there covering it as if they were to show up at E3.
More or
Yeah.
less.
Like, even because I had a chance to talk with the one year I went to E3. Just by chance, I talked with a guy who was there, like, from a marketing firm to kind of gauge what was going on and talk about it. He pointed out something that at the time I didn't know. This was the same year that Breath of the Wild got showcased at E3. But you did have like the big Activision conference at the time, the EA conference. Those weren't part of E3. They had gotten their own building separate from E3 and showed it off before because it was cheaper than showcasing at E3, but they still got all the same publicity doing that than giving the ESA a bunch of money.
Hmm. There and of course there were of course there around 2013. That's where you started to see the opening signs of the direct model, which is still in use to this day.
And quite frankly, has been a great model for Nintendo.
Uh, and it's a model that everybody else has struggled to keep up on, and I honestly think the only major company I can think of that's gotten what the intent has done something unique with the direct model was Devolver Digital, and they did it by turning their showcases into a giant shit post.
I think they hate E3. I know they always show up. They were always showing up to E3. I think they actively hated that conference. They were hilarious.
Yeah, hate's a strong word, so I'm not gonna jump on that per se. I will, however, state that it felt like what they were trying to do was what the VMAs were originally. Like when MTV started doing the Video Music Awards, it was meant as a um taking the piss out of award shows.
Definitely.
Uh, same thing goes with the Slammies. Especially if you look at like the very first one, and the fact that they, for the longest time, awards were the complete opposite of consistent.
Yeah.
But the and even with that, there was still hands-on booths for a few years. But after Nintendo Direct, you have EA Play. Then you have Sony and others doing their own things, or doing showcases before the convention even happens. Uh, and around 2015, they start to have limited public tickets. Of course, that same year that there was an attempt at doing a PC gaming show, which I don't remember if that ended up working out. In 2016, they tried to do a free E3 live event at the LA Live space. It managed to get like 20,000 people, but apparently that wasn't enough. Which the the LA Live, let me see how much that can um how much that can host. Which um it's not telling me. Then again, the LA Live is a bunch of a bunch of things. Uh,
I'll say I don't think the PC show at E3 ever really did all that much. Like, you did have a. It was basically a trailer collection, which you did not need E3 for.
no,
Like, when I was.
you especially didn't need. I'd imagine that trying to offer this separate thing, but open to the public, it had the image of a consolation prize.
Yeah. Like, when I checked out the PC show, it was before the actual thing you could go in. They had, like, a few demos up you could try. But that was around the time you started seeing like more demos become available for games anyway, just available online. So you're once again having to ask the question, why do I need to be here?
Hmm. They tr- in 27 they would gradually try and open um more more and more public tickets, and I do recall I do recall one person who what did not like the fact that those public tickets were there, but then again, he had a very boys club attitude, so take of that what you will. And yeah, you open things to the public, you're going to get some weirdos. That's 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 understandable, but the one of the things I had said at the time that was a concern when I started noticing that more tickets were being open to the public was there was going to be the inevitable question of what separates this from, say, WonderCon, which is a more open comic convention that's held at the same venue, just at a different time in the year. I think it's held in the spring. Um, and of course, in the 2010s, there were some infamous PR disasters. My like the time that Jamie Kennedy hosted Ubisoft's presentation and was sloshed out of his goddamn mind, or the infamous Bethesda Land incident. Hey, let's make a Bethesda themed theme park and do it outdoors in fucking June in California, in the middle of fucking LA. With with these vast swaths of people, and in a relative and a bit more, and crowding them up and all of that. It's like, do I even need to go into how many health hazards that is?
It's really weird seeing the mix of people both treating E3 as a trade show and then stuff like that where it's trying to look at it as more of a fan convention.
And granted, trying to. I'm not saying that doing a theme park spin on the idea is a terrible idea. Um, it's just terrible for that kind of time because I'm pretty sure most, like, I'm in Minnesota. The state fair takes place at the tail end of the summer, like around August.
It's because it's in between the freezing and the heat, not in the dead middle of one of them.
Yeah, where and yeah, August is certainly the dog days, and it's meant to be in mid to late August and early September. Because trying to do that in June or July is with that amount of people is stupid. I'm pretty sure the state fair where you live isn't going to try and do it in the middle of the summer.
No, it's generally at the beginning of summer or end of spring.
Hmm. And of course, part of the reason it probably would dip further into fall if it weren't for the fact that that's dipping into the Ren Fair, and that kind of conflict would create its own problems.
But yeah, a bit more like back to E3 itself, though. There's
Hmm.
one thing I think a lot of people started like putting blame on for the inevitable fall of E3, but I honestly think it only affected it by maybe a year or two, and that was all the pandemic stuff, shutting everything down.
I know it's easy to blame the pandemic for any number of failings. However, other conventions were shut down and managed to come back and stay back.
E3 itself, though, it was already kind of on that decline before the pandemic happened. And I think the biggest thing is what we brought up earlier, the rising prices. LA
the
is already not a cheap place to do anything.
there were the rising prices. There was the fact that a lot of the bigger developers were not seeing a reason why they
Yeah.
should even be there when they could just host their own events.
For
There
cheaper, even in LA.
there was there was also the fact that because of how easy it was to get information through the internet, that certainly robbed the exclusivity
Yeah.
of the matter. Um,
And of course, the Nintendo Direct model showcased to a lot of people early on you don't
and
need to spend this kind of money to get your stuff out there.
yeah, there was also the whole relationship with local retailers. The tug of war that I mentioned before regarding how public and how private the event should be. Uh, and there was there was also the fact that um, Mike Gallagher, who was the president of the ESA, was was involved in a bit of a spot of bother, as it were, especially since in 2016, revenue from running E3 accounted for almost half of the ESA's budget.
Not too
And
surprised.
the there seem there on one hand the ESA was acting like an advocacy group, and on the other end it was running E3. And of course more people were starting to have issues with the rising costs, especially since the mindset was the exposure wasn't worth the price.
Yeah, it was getting to the point there's basically almost no return on your investments. Like, yes, a lot of people still watched and a lot of information did get out, but that was happening outside of E3 by that point anyway.
Yeah,
It was such a small bump. I
they
don't see
lost
how
about
you could have done it.
between 2017 and 2019 they lost a third of their exhibitors.
That is not a small amount.
No, like it, in you went from 293 to 209.
And again, even like some of the bigger ones like Nintendo just started doing like a very small showcasing. So they weren't getting as much money from their bigger ones either.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and then if there's one thing that I think really contributed, it was that data leak in 2019.
Now, what came out in that data leak again? It's been a while.
Um, it was the it was personal attendee data.
Yeah, that one.
So we're talking we're talking about 2,000 plus people whose names and some of their and some of their private info was leaked. And and then apparently they found out that that similar data was found for past events. So supposedly supposedly a bunch of journalists got death threats over it, though. Whenever it comes to someone claiming that they got harassed or they got threats, you'll forgive me if I end up taking some of that with a grain of salt. Since 2019, um, we're right in the throes of the gaming journalism club getting exposed to the public. the problems of that boys club mentality starting to show up.
Now, I'm going to point out just something else that hasn't really been brought up quite yet. For as much money as you're going to be spending at a big event as E3, even though like it's easier to do like the straight Nintendo Direct style, it's also a lot cheaper. There's another much cheaper options a lot of like smaller companies had started doing more often, and that's just showing up to your smaller fan conventions or even a bigger convention like Comic-Con where there's people that are just there to be there. And for much less than you'd pay at E3, you could show up with an area at one of these conventions and show off your stuff to a lot of people that may not have been looking for it originally. You're still going to get all those same people who would have reported on it anyway reporting on it. So just the scene of fan conventions was becoming cheaper and a viable option to something huge like E3 that you might actually get a return from investment on your investment for. I don't think that was a huge factor in all of this, but I think it's another one of those little things that played a part.
Mm-hmm. It certainly did. It certainly did. And I think that after that whole thing happened, a bunch of scrambling started to happen and started to there was for the 2020 event before it got shit canned. There were because of the weights they had planned on implementing what they called Qtainment, which was basically their version of the fast pass system that's used in Disney parks. But if you've seen Defunct Land's long documentary on the way Fast Pass changed until it became um, Lightning Lane and Genie Plus, that's not exactly a model that you should be following.
Yeah.
Uh, they were also planning on doing influencer presentations on an appointment basis, and just trying to do a bunch of gimmicks, trying to throw shit at the wall and hoping something sticked. And the problem is a lot of the bigger folk decided that they were not going to show up.
You see, that's kind of where a lot of this comes down to. Like, there's a lot of little things that you can like look at that are like just pinging at the inevitable fall of E3. Almost all of these weird things, I think you could take out of the equation, and it's still going to just come down to two things: cost and how effectively it's actually getting your name out there.
Yeah. Obviously, there was the stuff that happened. There was the attempt to do a virtual version, which didn't quite work. There was the virtual event had a mixed reaction, especially since the mobile app for it, which even when it comes to conventions proper, the idea of using an app to track scheduling events at conventions, I always hate.
Like, the one that Anime Matsuri has was alright, just to help yourself keep track of what you're going to be doing. But
it's the principle of having me install an app that I'm only going to be using for 3 days at most.
Yeah. Especially for an online thing. You just you have a calendar on your computer.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can just check it from the site that you're going to be watching it on.
Yeah. but there 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 what there apparently were by the time of June of 2022 there were plans to try and return with a physical and virtual hybrid affair. Um and that they had partnered with Reed Pop, who operates stuff like New York Comic Con, Star Wars Celebration, and PAX to help on the management, as well as doing 3 business days and 2 fan days. But none of but the bigger guys didn't come back. Um, and then in March of 2023, 2023, sorry, the whole thing was shut down due to lack of sustained interest. And apparently the ESA has said that they're in discussions regarding the future of it, with plans of doing a reinvention. Then they did the whole thing where they said it was discontinued. Oh, and Reed Pop pulling out was a factor in in things ending.
Honestly, I think for like even the last few years that it was running, most of those big companies that did still show up only did so because they felt obligated to after years of doing it at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like even if none of the last few years had happened, I'd imagine we'd still be doing this episode, if not like a year or two later than we're doing it right now.
Yeah, one of the thing one of the things that I do think should be made very, very clear is there have been some narratives that have cropped up in the aftermath. One of them is that the convention slash trade show thing is just not something that's viable in the current market. Except a lot of the other major conventions that were that that were still around in that same time frame are still in operation. TGS shows no sign of stopping. Gamescom is still a thing. CES is still a thing, and obviously the more open to the public conventions like Comic Con, PAX, C2E2, those are still a thing.
Yeah, all the ones that weren't specifically trade shows. So I think that makes it a little different, but yeah,
Well,
still
TGS
relevant.
and Gamescom are still trade shows.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like the other ones you mentioned, not
Mhm.
really trade shows, so I don't think it's fair to kind of lump them together. But those first two, yeah, entirely fair comparison.
Mhm. The of the other thing is that I've seen the argument made that COVID ended up killing it off. COVID was a factor, but it wasn't the factor. As you said already, if it weren't for COVID, we would have still been doing this just months or years later than we actually did. Largely because, for one, there was this whole of we have to hold it in LA because it's LA, but it's also getting more and more expensive to hold it in LA for both ourselves and for our partners.
Like holding it in LA in those early years was a great idea because that was Silicon Valley. Everything was centered there. But as the
Hmm.
internet got bigger and more prominent, having to hold it there became less and less necessary. But they didn't think like that, apparently.
There, and of course, as I mentioned before, there were a couple times where they tried holding it outside of LA, and that didn't quite work. Though I think in the times that they did hold it in Atlanta, that wasn't a terrible idea. It was just too early.
They
Also,
held off
I'd
on that for
imagine,
about 5 years. I think it'd have been a great move.
although Atlanta may not have been my first choice unless I want to make a bunch of journalists suffer by having them go through Atlanta traffic.
I mean, they already had to deal with LA traffic, so.
And I can I could flip a coin about who's got it worse. It's the equivalent of, would you rather be would you find it worse to be punched in the balls or kicked in the balls? Trick question. You're still on the floor. You know, doesn't matter if you get punched or kicked down there. You're on the floor in pain. But I do think that one of the canaries in the coal mine was that first time that people were complaining about the cost.
Yeah, because it was never cheap to begin with. It's LA. It's about one of the most expensive places in the US you could do something like this.
Hmm.
And it just kept getting more and more expensive. And for some reason, like it was, as we also mentioned, it was more expensive to hold it at E3 specifically, not just LA, because you'd have those people like EA and Microsoft who just rent out their own buildings and do a thing a day or two before. That was cheaper than buying a booth from EA or from the ESA.
Pretty much.
Like there is no getting around how huge E3 was and for how long it really did matter.
Hmm.
But at some
And
point it just stopped being relevant almost overnight, I think,
yeah.
and it just took people a while to realize that.
Now here's where we get into a bit of theory crafting and a bit of picking your brain for a bit. Um, do you think that with a bit of restructuring, E3 could come back, even if it's not with the name E3?
Potentially. Largely because I think you need to get it somewhere cheaper than California. I think that's going to be a necessity right now. But you get somewhere cheaper that's going to be more affordable. I think you need to make sure, like, even those smaller guys, not just your major media outlets, are going to have access to it. Not necessarily a complete public opening, which I would not be opposed to, but let's be realistic, they probably don't want to do that. I think it's doable. Start looking at some of the ones that stuck around that did work, like Tokyo Game Show, and model it a little more after something like that. I don't know if we really need it to come back in any form right now, but I think it's possible.
I think there is certainly a place and a way to do the event. However, I think that the one of the bigger issues and bigger hurdles to deal with is the fact that there has been a significant shift in the last decade. That shift being the rise and the proliferation of the returning AA market. For a good chunk of the seventh generation, the AAA end of things had the lion's share. But with more and more indies and more of a new form of a AA market, that started to shift.
I think of returning E3 would want to give more of a focus onto that AA and even your indie markets than they have in the past. Because again, like those AAA companies, I don't think they I think even the ones in dire straits right now are realizing relying on those kind of events isn't going to help them too much. They're already big enough. People are going to know what they're doing. But a focus on your double A and your indies, I think would actually benefit a lot of people.
And that a as far as a focus on AA, that's more or less what we've gotten with stuff like Steam Next Fest and Summer of Gaming.
So I guess then it'd be a question of would an E3 really have a place at all right now? Just because I'm now trying to think of what you would actually have to do to bring in a new big event like that. That would really matter.
I think it could.
See, the more I think,
But
the more I think it's the lack of necessity for anything like that that might be what dooms it.
Mhm. uh, though truth be told, I think it would be. I think you'd be far more likely to see a relationship with expanding a more public one. I think the idea of that closed off kind of convention just for gaming isn't going to work. For certain trades, you can have that industry only type of trade show, but gaming has gotten too big over the years to really make that viable.
I don't even know if it's just the size, it's also a lot of the culture surrounding gaming. There tends to be a lot more investment from your average people about what goes on compared to some other things. So people care and dig in a lot more. At least in a more general sense.
I could see that. But as far I think one of the bigger things to be concerned about is with E3 gone, that ends up killing off one of the big points of leverage that the ESA had. And am I saying that the ESA is going to go the way of the dodo in a few years? No.
It's possible it'll happen sometime down the line. Because I'm kind of. I don't even remember everything the ESA's actually does outside of E3. Yeah, that's all that's coming to mind is E3.
Um, they they claim there's the claim of being an advocacy group for gaming, but keep in mind that the ESA was on the opposite end of the table during that infamous hearing over in Hawaii regarding um, loot boxes.
Yeah. That
So,
that was a mess of a thing.
oh, it certainly was. But the point is that their the amount of pull that they're really going to have is largely just the ESRB at most, and I'm not and you're gonna see more and more splitting off. I'd say is the real thing to take away from it.
Yeah. Now with that, I think we pretty much covered E3.
Yeah. As far as whether or not something like this is going to be done for other trade shows, no, not really. Um, there's the language barrier when it comes to talking about Gamescom, and there's the different language barrier when it comes to talking about TGS, and I don't really see a need to talk about either. I will, however, note one of my favorite moments from the early days of the convention, and that was when Sony did probably the biggest flex possible.
Release the price of the PS4.
No, no, I'm talking a bigger one. So there was a bunch of hemming and hawing about the absurd price of the Sega Saturn. Then a representative then at E3 that year, the representative um so for Sony walks up regarding the upcoming PlayStation, says $299 and walks off, basically undercutting their competition by $100.
So effectively the same thing, but earlier.
Yeah, time is a flat circle. Of course, if you want to talk about the flex when it came to the PS4, the big one was that video where it's like, here's how you share games on the PS4.
I loved
Here you
that
go.
one. Oh, how far Sony has fallen over one console generation.
It's it's amazing how there's the phrase about how the boss of a company dictates its culture. And well, the guy that they had for a lot of that PS4 generation, he's not there. He got moved elsewhere because they wanted to headquarter more of their stuff in California. We see how that's working out.
Yeah.
You know, what with there being discussion about whether or not the PS5 should be sunsetted as if its generation is over.
I will say
Which,
though, one more fun thing about E3 that year I went down there with Base Gamer at the time.
mm-hmm.
And like during the last night there we were gonna see there's probably gonna be some after parties going on now that we're done. They were doing one or Microsoft was doing one. Now it didn't mention that it was like an invite only one, but they let us right through the front door. And then I'm sitting there realizing all the Microsoft people are boozing up all of the fucking game store representatives who were supposed to be there. Like they were the ones with the invites. Just buttering up. Oh, you're the guys that are doing great for us. You're the one moving all of our products as they're giving them free booze all night.
Yeah, that tracks.
It's like, yep, that sounds like an E3 after party right there. You keep doing you, Microsoft. What was funny when they realized we weren't one of the invited people, like three of us were together, we were asked to leave. We realized one other person was still in there. The other guy's like, oh, I'll just go in and find him. Just walked right back in through the front door. They let him right back in. Like less than 2 minutes after getting kicked out. Because that was the level of security they had. It was great.
Yeah.
But with that,
I never went to the after party because I had a different party I was going to. Plus, I don't like going to after parties as it is.
Yeah. I'm with you there. But it was worth it just for that. But yeah, that said, I think we'll now wrap up our E3 talks.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget, like, next month we actually have an episode planned out. We'll be talking about Genion / Pioneer, as they were known right before that.
Mm-hmm.
Next week, you can continue to see me and Mildra talk about Shattered RPG, a post-apocalyptic fantasy RPG setting. And with that, we will see you guys here next month.
Stay frosty.